The French and Indian War, or Seven Years' War, represented the decisive turning point in British colonial relations. The Treaty of Paris in 1763, ending the war, ratified Britain's undisputed control of the seas and shipping trade, as well as its control over much of the North American continent east of the Mississippi River, including French Canada. But a steep price came with this victory. The British government had borrowed heavily from British and Dutch banks to finance the war, and as a result, the national debt almost doubled from 75 million British pounds in 1754 to 133 million British pounds in 1763. When Prime Minister George Grenville decided to tax the colonies, he did not consider whether the Parliament in England had the authority to do so. Like most Englishmen, he believed that the government's legitimacy derived ultimately from the consent of the people, but he defined consent far more loosely than did the colonists. Americans had come to believe that they could be represented only by men for whom they or their property holding neighbors had actually voted. To Grenville and the English as a whole, however, Parliament by definition represented all English subjects wherever they lived. According to this theory of government called virtual representation, the colonists were said to be virtually, if not actually, represented in Parliament. In the years before 1763, the colonists had become accustomed to a British government that wielded only limited authority over them and affected their daily lives very little. They believed that a good government was one that largely left them alone. In the mid 1760s, the colonists did not, however, immediately accuse Grenville of intending to oppress them. They first simply questioned the usefulness of the new laws. The first new taxes, the Sugar and Currency Acts, were passed by Parliament in 1764. The Sugar Act revised the existing system of custom regulations. It created new taxes on certain foreign imports into the colonies. The Currency Act, in effect, forbid the colonies from issuing paper money. Americans could accumulate little hard cash, little gold or silver, since they imported more than they exported, so more hard currency went out than came in. The act seemed to the colonists to deprive them of the means of doing business. Since the American economy was suffering a severe post-war depression, it's not surprising that both individual colonists and colonial governments decided to protest the new policies. But lacking any precedent for a united campaign against acts of Parliament, Americans in 1764 took only hesitant and uncoordinated steps. 8 colonial legislatures sent separate petitions to Parliament requesting the repeal of the Sugar Act. They argued that the act placed severe restrictions on their economies and they had not consented to its passage. They also instructed their agents in London to lobby against another proposed tax. That tax, the Stamp Act, was modeled on a law that had been in effect in England for nearly a century. It would touch nearly every colonist by requiring tax stamps on most printed materials. Anyone who purchased a newspaper or pamphlet, made a will, transferred land or borrowed money, bought dice or playing cards, needed a liquor license, accepted a government appointment would have to pay the tax. Never before had a tax measure of such scope had been proposed for the colonies. The act would also require that tax stamps be paid for with hard money and that violators could be tried in courts without juries. Finally, such a law would break decisively with the colonial tradition of the colonies themselves imposing their own taxes. The ultimate effectiveness of Americans' opposition to the Stamp Act did not rest on ideological arguments over Parliament's power, but what gave the resistance its primary force were the decisive and inventive actions of the colonists during the late summer and fall of 1765. In August, the Loyal Nine, a Boston social club of printers, distillers, and other artisans, organized a demonstration against the Stamp Act. Early in the morning of August 14th, the demonstrators hung a likeness of the province's stamp distributor from a tree on Boston Common. That night, the crowd destroyed a building they assumed was going to be the tax office. In an unplanned act, the members of the crowd broke most of the windows of the stamp distributor's house, who then publicly promised not to fulfill the duties of his office. Residents of other colonies drew two important conclusions from these and other Boston mob actions. First, they realized they could prevent the Stamp Act from being implemented by forcing the stamp distributors to resign. Second, they recognized the danger of inciting mob action to achieve their goals. Although mobs could be useful, they would have to be carefully controlled to avoid excessive violence. The Stamp Act controversy drew Americans into the politics of empire for the first time. Lower class whites, blacks, and women began to participate in public discussions and demonstrations. These groups had often expressed their opinions on local issues and occasionally took to the streets, but never had they been stirred by British imperial policy. The goals of this newly politicized American population were often different from those of the Stamp Act resistant leaders. The Loyal Nine had accomplished its goal when the stamp distributor agreed not to fulfill his duties, but the Boston crowd had its own goals. Top on the list seems to have been a desire to punish the Lieutenant Governor, Thomas Hutchinson, for his showy display of wealth in a city where poverty seemed to be increasing. A mob completely destroyed Hutchinson's elaborately furnished home. The Loyal Nine's tactics were immediately imitated elsewhere in the colonies. The organized crowd actions were so successful that by November 1st, when the law was scheduled to go into effect, not a single stamp distributor was willing to carry out the duties of his office. To coordinate their efforts, resistance leaders throughout the colonies formed an association known as the Sons of Liberty. While British Parliament would eventually repeal the Stamp Act, it reserved the right to tax and regulate the colonies. Over the next several years, Parliament passed laws that did just this. American colonists responded by engaging in increasingly confrontational protests that included wide participation of residents from all levels of colonial society. The tea tax, for example, resulted in the Boston Tea Party, with disguised colonists dumping British tea in Boston Harbor. By the early 1770s, the colonies were fairly united in their opposition to British attempts to tax and regulate the colonies. They were not, however, ready to declare independence. Most colonists continued to view themselves as British citizens who simply had disagreements with the British government. The First Continental Congress met from September 5th to October 26, 1774. This Congress was made up of delegates from all the colonies except Georgia. It met at Carpenter's Hall, Philadelphia. The meeting's general purpose was to express colonial grievances against British policy. Only a few radical members considered the possibility of breaking with England. The session's most important act was the creation of the Continental Association, which forbid importation and use of British goods and proposed prohibition of colonial exports. It was agreed that the colonies would refuse to import British goods until their grievances with the British government were corrected. Those grievances were listed in petitions to the king, and the Congress adjourned until May 10, 1775. Before the Continental Congress met again, the situation had changed. On the morning of April 19, 1775, shots had been exchanged by colonists and British soldiers, men had been killed, and a revolution had begun. The British commander at Boston, General Thomas Gage, sought to avoid armed rebellion by sending a column of Royal Infantry from Boston to capture colonial military arms at Concord. News of his plan was spread to the countryside by Paul Revere, William Dawes, and Samuel Prescott. As the advance column reached Lexington, they came upon a group of militia, the Minutemen. After a brief exchange of shots in which several Americans were killed, the colonials withdrew, and the British continued to Concord. Here, they destroyed some military supplies, fought with other colonists, and began a rushed withdrawal to Boston, which cost them over 200 casualties. The war was on. Some delegates had come to the Continental Congress already committed to declaring the colonies independent of Great Britain, but even many strong upholders of the colonial cause were not ready to take such a step. The lines were being more clearly drawn between pro-British loyalists and colonial revolutionaries. The time was one of indecision, and the division of the people was symbolized by the split between Benjamin Franklin and his loyalist son, William Franklin. Loyalists were numerous and included small farmers as well as large landowners, royal office holders, and members of the professions. They were to be found in varying strength in every colony. A large part of the population was more or less neutral, swaying to this side or that, or else remaining neutral in the struggle, which was to some extent a civil war. That is, often early in the American Revolution, colonists were fighting among themselves, loyalists and patriots. And it was to remain largely like this to the end of the war itself. Throughout the American Revolution, there were at least some colonists in every colony that remained loyal to Great Britain. Civil government and administration fell apart under such conditions and had to be patched together locally. One historian has estimated that this war for freedom extended civil rights to about 15% of the population, leaving the poorer colonists, the slaves, all women, and Native Americans pretty much at the mercies of the few. The Revolutionary War was full of contradictions for African Americans in particular. The clearest contradiction involved slavery and the ideology the Founding Fathers come to use to justify breaking with England. In November 1775, Lord Dunmore, the royal governor of Virginia, issued a proclamation promising freedom to any white indentured servant or black slave who joined the British. Rumors spread throughout Virginia that slaves were flocking to join the British. In New York, an African American mother was said to have named her son after the lordship. In Philadelphia, a black man was rumored to have jostled whites on the street and told them to wait until Lord Dunmore and his black regiment come, and then we will see who is to take the wall. Despite the small number of African Americans who actually reached Lord Dunmore, it's clear that colonial leaders feared the effects of this proclamation. A month after the proclamation, George Washington wrote, "If that man Dunmore is not crushed before spring, he will become the most dangerous man in America. His strength will increase like a snowball rolling downhill. Success will depend on which side can arm the Negroes the faster." Uncommitted Southern planters were both angered and fearful of Dunmore's proclamation. Maryland planters foresaw united action by poor whites and African American slaves, aided by the British, to seize the best land and divide it among themselves. Virginia slave owners shared this view and, in its convention's call for independence, denounced Dunmore. In a sense, many saw that to crush a potential slave rebellion of major proportions, they had to rebel against the mother country, England. That is, to prevent a slave revolt. Many, who weren't initially sure that independence from England was a good idea, came to believe that independence was a necessity. On July 16, 1776, 2 months after the British proclamation, the Continental Congress agreed to the re-enlistment of free blacks. Soon afterwards, due to the problem of raising sufficient troops to wage the war, the Continental Congress would enlist slaves as well. A third of the men who signed the Declaration of Independence, the document declaring the right to independent nationhood on the self-evident truth that all men are created equal, a third of the men who signed this document owned other humans. In addition, the nation that was created was one in which slavery was a foundation of the society, in which 500,000 African American slaves lived, and in which the wealthiest Southerners would not even consider joining without a clear recognition of their right to own slaves. But the contradictions involve more than slavery and revolutionary ideology. The revolution made it possible for some blacks to gain their freedom. It led to the ending of slavery in the states north of Maryland and a good deal of manumission in the Upper South. It also gave others, the landless, the poor, women, the idea that freedom was not just a hope or a goal to be attained, but a right to expect. The American Revolution resulted in the independence of the colonies and the birth of a new nation. It also marked the beginning of another revolution for rights that would continue to be fought in the new United States of America.